One coffee, 4 words, and that smug smile that shattered my world. He thought I'd leave quietly after 18 months of carrying his department on my back. But he forgot one thing: I don't walk away from the table without flipping it first. Before dinner that night, I'd crushed his $91 million deal, and he never saw what hit him. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just a missing signature on page 76 of a compliance binder nobody bothered to read. My name is Madison Reed, and until 3:45 p.m. on December 14th, I believed competence mattered more than politics at Vaymont Systems. That was the exact moment Elliot Crane, our CFO, slid a bonus slip across his mahogany desk with the theatrical precision of someone who'd rehearsed this humiliation in front of his bathroom mirror. $1,500. Not $15,000, not the $50,000 my predecessor had received for half the work. $1,500 after 18 months of 70-hour weeks, after architecting the most complex data infrastructure this company had ever seen, after personally preventing 3 system-wide crashes that would have cost us millions. "I know this isn't what you expected," Elliot said, adjusting his Italian silk tie, the blue one he always wore, to difficult conversations. His corner office overlooked downtown Seattle, rain streaking the windows like the city itself was crying for my dignity. "But frankly, Madison, the board has concerns." I kept my hands perfectly still on my lap. In engineering, we learned that the most dangerous failures happen in silence, not with explosions. Concerns. He opened my performance review folder, pristine, untouched since HR had delivered it that morning. I knew because the coffee ring from his morning espresso hadn't yet branded its cover. "Your technical skills are adequate, certainly, but leadership requires more than coding expertise." He paused, savoring the moment like aged whiskey. "The consensus is that you have lazy hands, no spark." Lazy hands, no spark. The words hung between us like a challenge. This from a man who couldn't distinguish between Python and JavaScript, who once asked me why we couldn't just download more RAM to fix a memory leak. This from someone who'd spent the last quarter taking credit for the Atlas Bridge project, my project, in every board presentation, while I debugged critical failures at 3 a.m. "I see," I said, my voice steady as a flat line. Outside, Seattle's December darkness was already creeping in at 4 p.m., casting long shadows across his office. The city lights below flickered like dying stars. Elliot's smile widened, mistaking my calm for defeat. "I'm glad you're taking this professionally. Your last day will be January 3rd, enough time to transition your projects. Kara Voss will be taking over your team. Fresh perspective, you understand. Someone with more energy." Kara Voss, 28 years old, MBA from Wharton, 6 months at the company. She'd asked me last week what a API stood for. I picked up the bonus slip, folded it precisely in half, then quarters. The paper was heavy stock. Expensive everything at Elliot's level was designed to intimidate. "Of course, I'll ensure a smooth transition." "That's the spirit." He was already turning to his monitor, dismissing me with the casual indifference of someone stepping over a puddle. "HR will send the paperwork. Standard severance. Naturally. 2 weeks. 2 weeks severance after building the infrastructure that his entire $91 million Operation Horizon depended on. After creating the Atlas Bridge that connected our legacy systems to the new architecture, a piece of engineering so complex that I was the only person in the company who fully understood its logic flows. I stood, smoothing my blazer. "I'll start documenting everything immediately." "No need to go overboard," Elliot chuckled, that practiced executive laugh that never reached his eyes. "Kara's smart. She'll figure it out." That's when I smiled, really smiled for the first time in that meeting, because Elliot Crane, in his arrogance, had just made the fatal mistake that would cost him everything. He'd assumed I was the kind of person who would slink away quietly, who would accept humiliation as the price of corporate politics. But he'd forgotten the first rule of engineering: every system has a point of failure. And I knew exactly where his was. The Atlas Bridge wasn't just code, it was my masterpiece. 3 million lines of logic that transformed Veymont's prehistoric COBOL systems into something that could actually talk to modern cloud infrastructure. I'd written it during endless nights, fueled by cold brew and the naive belief that excellence would be rewarded. Now, sitting in my dimly lit office at 9:30 p.m., I stared at the architecture diagram spread across my 3 monitors. Everyone else had gone home hours ago, leaving me alone with the hum of servers and the distant sound of janitors emptying trash bins. Perfect conditions for what I was about to do. The beauty of the Atlas Bridge was its complexity. I'd built it in layers, like a Russian doll of dependencies, each module requiring specific authentication protocols and compliance checks. The documentation alone ran 76 pages, single-spaced, filled with warnings about critical integration points that could cascade into system-wide failures if mishandled. Elliot had never read a single page. I knew this because I'd embedded tracking pixels in the PDF, a little paranoia that now felt like prophecy. The access logs showed he'd opened the file exactly once, for 4 seconds, probably just long enough to forward it to someone else. I pulled up the core authentication module, the heart of the entire system. This wasn't about sabotage. I was too smart for that. Sabotage leaves fingerprints, creates liability, gives them ammunition. No, this was about compliance, about following every single corporate guideline to the letter. With surgical precision, I began encoding additional security layers into the most critical logic flows. Each modification was perfectly legal, completely within my authority as system architect. I marked them all with compliance flags. IP-sensitive requires original author verification before deployment. The timestamp showed 10:47 p.m. when I finished. Every critical module now carried my signature requirement not in some hidden backdoor way, but right there in the metadata, in the comments, in the compliance tracking system that our legal department had insisted we implement after the last SEC audit. I documented everything meticulously in the official binder, the physical one that corporate policy still required for critical infrastructure changes. Page 76, subsection C, clause 7.1c. Any logic marked as IP-sensitive requires written authorization from the original author before production deployment. This protection ensures intellectual property compliance and prevents unauthorized modifications to critical systems. The language was deliberately bureaucratic, mind-numbingly boring, the kind of text that executives skip over, assuming someone else will handle the details, but it was also legally bulletproof, reviewed and approved by our own legal department 6 months ago. I placed the binder in the designated compliance cabinet, exactly where it was supposed to be. Anyone could access it, anyone could read it. The fact that no one would was not my problem. Before leaving, I sent one final email to the team, CCing Elliot and Kara. Team, as part of my transition, I've completed a comprehensive security review of the Atlas Bridge. All documentation has been updated and filed in the compliance cabinet. Please note that several modules have been flagged for IP-sensitive handling per our standard protocols. Best of luck with Operation Horizon. Madison. Professional, helpful, absolutely devastating. Elliot replied within minutes. Thanks for being thorough. Kara will take it from here. I sat back in my chair, looking at the city lights through my window. Somewhere out there, Elliot was probably at his country club, toasting to his brilliant restructuring. Kara was likely updating her LinkedIn, announcing her exciting new role. The board was reviewing projections for Operation Horizon, seeing $91 million in efficiency gains. None of them understood what I'd just done. I hadn't planted a bomb, I'd simply removed all the safety mechanisms that prevented them from building one themselves. Every shortcut they'd take, every compliance check they'd ignore, every warning they'd dismiss as overly cautious, would tighten the noose they were fashioning with their own hands. The cleaning lady knocked on my door. Working late again, Madison. Just finishing up some documentation. Rosa? I logged off, gathered my personal items into a box, a coffee mug, a stress ball, a photo from the team launch party where Elliot had called me the backbone of our technical infrastructure. You okay? Rosa asked, noticing the box. Never better, I said, and meant it, because I knew something Elliot didn't in 2 weeks. When they tried to deploy Operation Horizon without my signature, the entire system would refuse to initialize, not because I broke it, but because it would be working exactly as designed, exactly as documented, exactly as legally required. The trap wasn't in what I'd done. It was in what they wouldn't do. Read the documentation, follow the procedures, respect the complexity of what they'd so casually dismissed along with me. January 4th, my first day of unemployment. While I sipped coffee in my apartment at 10 a.m., Elliot was unveiling Operation Horizon to the board, promising a complete infrastructure overhaul that would save $91 million over 3 years. Tina Morales, my former teammate and current spy, sent me screenshots from the all-hands meeting. Elliot stood at the podium, his slide deck gleaming with promises. Seamless integration by Q4. Zero downtime migration. Revolutionary efficiency gains. Behind him. Kara nodded enthusiastically, her fresh energy radiating through the conference room. She'd already renamed my team Innovation Squad and introduced daily synergy scrums at 7 a.m. The first signs of trouble came within a week. Tina's text arrived at 11:15 p.m. Kara just asked the team to skip the old documentation and build fresh. Says your stuff is overly complex. I smiled, pouring myself a glass of wine. Of course she did. Why wade through 76 pages of technical specifications when you could just wing it, after all? How hard could it be? By week 2, the cracks were showing. The test environment started throwing errors, nothing catastrophic, just annoying timeout messages and failed API calls. Kara's solution. Let's increase the server capacity. Madison was always too conservative with resources. Elliot approved the additional spending immediately. Another $40,000 thrown at a problem that had nothing to do with server capacity. The real issue was buried in the authentication modules, waiting patiently like a spider in its web. Tina kept me updated with a stream of increasingly panicked messages. Pipeline showing green, but data returns null fields. Kara says it's testing artifacts, pushing forward with deployment schedule. Elliot just announced accelerated timeline, wants to impress investors at quarterly review. By week 3, even Kara's relentless optimism was fraying. The development environment was, in Tina's words, a complete dumpster fire. Data mappings failed randomly. Integration points timed out. The legacy systems refused to handshake with the new architecture. But here's where Elliot's management philosophy kicked in. Instead of investigating the root cause, he called for vision huddles every morning at 6:45 a.m. His solution to technical problems was motivational posters and team-building exercises. Fail fast, fail forward, became the rallying cry, printed on T-shirts that arrived via overnight shipping. Meanwhile, Kara was drowning. I almost felt sorry for her almost. She'd divided the Atlas Bridge into chunks, assigned different pieces to different developers, none of whom understood how the modules interconnected. It was like giving a symphony to musicians who'd never seen a full score, then wondering why the music sounded wrong. The 4th week brought Carl Donovan into the picture. Carl was old school, a back-end engineer who'd been with Vaymont for 15 years. He didn't buy into buzzwords or motivational seminars. He believed in documentation, in understanding systems before modifying them. Tina's message came at 2:30 a.m. Carl's been in the office for 12 hours straight. He found something. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. Carl was the only person at Vaymont who might actually read the documentation, who might notice the compliance flags, who might understand what I'd done. The next morning's message confirmed it. Carl's asking about metadata warnings, says there are compliance flags all over the critical modules. Kara told him to ignore them. Madison's paranoia, she said, but Carl's not letting it go. This was the beautiful part. I hadn't hidden anything. Every warning was visible, every requirement documented, every compliance flag properly registered in the system. They'd had a month to notice, a month to ask questions, a month to request my signature for deployment authorization. Instead, they'd chosen to ignore it all. Carl spent the next 3 days diving deep into the commit logs, the schema history, the audit trails. He traced every modification, every flag, every warning I'd left behind. Unlike Kara, Carl understood that in enterprise systems, paranoia isn't a bug, it's a feature. Thursday, 3 p.m. Tina sent a single line. Carl found the binder. I imagined him in the compliance cabinet, dust motes dancing in the fluorescent light. Turning to page 76, his finger tracking down to subsection C, clause 7.1c, the slow dawning realization of what those dry bureaucratic words actually meant. Every IP-sensitive module required my signature. Without it, deploying to production would violate corporate compliance policy, and Elliot had already announced to investors that Operation Horizon would go live in 6 days. Carl was too much of a professional to panic, but Tina said he walked out of the documentation room looking like he'd seen a ghost. He went straight to his desk, pulled up the deployment checklist, and began cross-referencing every module against the compliance requirements. By 5 p.m., he'd found 17 critical modules, all marked IP-sensitive, all requiring authorization from Madison Reed, the employee Elliot had terminated with 2 weeks severance and a $1,000 insult. The trap had just snapped shut. They just didn't know it yet. Friday morning, 8 a.m. Kara stood before the innovation squad, her usually perfect composure cracking at the edges. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, the kind you get from discovering your pipeline is lying to you at 3 a.m. Great news! Everyone... Her voice pitched too high, too bright. All systems are showing green. We're ready for Monday's production deploy. Carl sat in the back, silent. Tina told me later that he'd tried to raise the compliance issue in a private meeting with Kara at 7 that morning. Her response: "We don't have time for bureaucratic nonsense. Elliot wants this live before the investor dinner on Monday." The test environment, meanwhile, was having a nervous breakdown. Data that went in clean came out corrupted. API calls that worked in isolation failed in sequence. The sandbox, their safe space for testing, had crashed 4 times since midnight. But the dashboards showed green. Kara had configured them to monitor uptime, not data integrity. The system was running. Technically, like a car with no engine is still a car. Technically. Elliot made his appearance at the noon stand-up, designer coffee in hand, his favorite Friday tie, the one with tiny dollar signs that he thought was clever. "I don't want to hear problems. People, I want solutions. We've promised the board a revolution, and we're going to deliver." Carl finally spoke up. "Sir, we have a compliance issue." "Then fix it." Elliot's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. "That's why we pay you, Carl, to fix things, not to find excuses." Tina captured the moment in a discreet photo, Carl's face, a study in professional horror as he realized nobody was going to listen. By 3 p.m., desperation had set in. Kara had divided the team into strike forces with military-inspired names: Alpha Team, Bravo Team, Charlie Team. Each was assigned a different fire to fight, none understanding that they were all symptoms of the same disease. Alpha Team tried to patch the data corruption by adding validation layers, but without understanding the underlying authentication flow, they just created new bottlenecks. Bravo Team attempted to stabilize the API by increasing timeout limits. 20 seconds, 30, a full minute. Users would love waiting 60 seconds for every database call. Charlie Team, led by a junior developer named Marcus, actually stumbled onto something important. He found the fallback scripts, or rather, the absence of them. Every critical module referenced fallback procedures that didn't exist. The documentation called for them, the code expected them, but the actual scripts were nowhere in the deployment folder. "Where are the fallback scripts?" Marcus asked in the team Slack channel. Kara's response was immediate. "Building new ones. Madison's were outdated anyway." But here's what Kara didn't understand. You can't build fallback scripts without understanding what you're falling back from. It's like writing a parachute manual without knowing how planes work. Saturday, the weekend before launch, the entire team was called in for a war room session. Pizza boxes stacked up like monuments to poor planning. Energy drinks created a caffeine haze that made everything seem both urgent and unreal. Carl had given up trying to explain the compliance issue. Instead, he'd started documenting every warning he'd raised, every response he'd received, every decision made against his recommendations. He was building his own paper trail, protecting himself from the explosion he saw coming. Around 4 p.m., something interesting happened. The test environment stabilized. Not fixed, stabilized, like a patient in a coma has stable vital signs. "See," Kara announced triumphantly, "we just needed to push through the resistance." What had actually happened was that Marcus, in desperation, had disabled several authentication modules entirely. The system stopped failing because it stopped trying. It was like curing a headache by removing the head. But the metrics looked good. Response times were down. Error rates had dropped. The dashboard gleamed green like a Christmas tree of lies. Elliot arrived at 6 p.m. for a status check, fresh from his golf course, still wearing his polo shirt. He looked at the green dashboard and clapped Kara on the shoulder. "This is what success looks like. Madison would have taken 6 months to achieve what you've done in 3 weeks." Carl muttered something under his breath. Tina said it sounded like, "Achieving nothing is easy when you skip everything important." Sunday night, 11:45 p.m., T-minus 8 hours until production deployment. The war room looked like a battlefield. Empty pizza boxes had evolved into a fortress. Someone had written "help" on the whiteboard in red marker. Kara stood before the exhausted team, trying one more time to inject enthusiasm into the room. "Tomorrow, we make history. Tomorrow, we show everyone what Innovation Squad can do." Carl had stopped coming to the office. His last message in the Slack channel was a link to the compliance documentation and a simple note. "For the record, deployment without proper authorization violates Section 7.1c. Legal has been notified." But his message was buried under hundreds of others' bug reports, fix attempts, motivational quotes from Elliot, and increasingly frantic coordination attempts. The trap wasn't just set anymore. They were actively walking into it, eyes wide open, ignoring every warning sign because stopping would mean admitting failure. And in Elliot's world, failure was the only unforgivable sin. Except, of course, for the sin of deploying $91 million worth of promises on a foundation that was about to collapse. Monday, 7 a.m. Carl Donovan sat alone in the compliance office, the binder open before him like a prophecy. He'd arrived at 5:30, before even the security guards had finished their rounds. The 76 pages had become his obsession, particularly page 76 itself, the one everyone else had ignored. He photographed every page, every clause, every warning I'd meticulously documented. Then he did something brilliant. He searched the company's email archives for any mention of Clause 7.1c. 6 months ago, Diana Brooks from Legal had sent a company-wide memo. "New IP protection protocols are now in effect. Please review Section 7.1c for critical system requirements." The email had 43 recipients, including Elliot Crane, who'd responded with a thumbs-up emoji. Carl printed everything: the memo, Elliot's response, the complete audit trail showing when the binder had been filed, who had access, who had been notified. He was building a case, not for court, but for survival. At 8:15, he requested a meeting with Diana Brooks. Urgent compliance violation risk for Operation Horizon. Diana, unlike Elliot, actually read documentation. It was her job to protect the company from liability, and she took it seriously. She arrived at Carl's desk within 10 minutes, her expression shifting from annoyed to alarmed as she read through his evidence. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that they're about to deploy 17 IP-sensitive modules without the required authorization?" "In approximately 6 hours," Carl confirmed. "The investor dinner is at 7 tonight. Elliot wants the system live before then." Diana's face went pale. She understood what Carl was showing her. This wasn't just a technical violation, it was a material breach that could void their insurance, trigger SEC investigations, and expose the company to massive lawsuits if anything went wrong. "Who's the original author?" she asked. "Madison Reed. Terminated January 3rd. Diana actually laughed a short, bitter sound. They fired the only person who could authorize this deployment. Meanwhile, in the war room, Kara was leading the final deploy preparations. The team had stopped questioning anything. They were in pure execution mode, following orders like soldiers marching toward a cliff. At 9:45, Diana Brooks sent an email that would later be known as the memo that killed Operation Horizon. She didn't bury the lead. "Immediate halt required. Operation Horizon deployment violates Compliance Section 7.1c. No IP-sensitive modules may be deployed without original author authorization. Madison Reed's signature is required for 17 critical components. Proceeding without authorization would constitute willful violation of corporate IP protection protocols." She CC'd legal, the CTO, the entire board of directors, and crucially external audit. The email hit like a bomb. Within minutes, Elliot was calling Diana, his voice audible through her office walls. But Diana had done her homework. She had the documentation, the audit trail, the proof that everyone had been notified about the requirements months ago. At 10:30, an emergency meeting was called. The boardroom filled with executives, lawyers, and one very nervous Kara Voss. Carl presented his findings with clinical precision, laying out each violation, each ignored warning, each moment where someone could have stopped this but chose not to. The CTO, Jennifer Walsh, was the first to grasp the full scope. "You're telling me our $91 million initiative depends on modules we can't legally deploy?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Carl replied. Elliot tried to salvage the situation. "Surely we can get retroactive authorization. Where's Madison now?" Diana pulled up my termination paperwork. "You gave her 2 weeks severance and marked her as performance issues. She has no obligation to help us. And considering the circumstances of her departure, no incentive either." The room fell silent. They all knew what Diana wasn't saying. They'd burned that bridge with unnecessary cruelty. "Can we rebuild the modules?" someone suggested. Carl shook his head. "The Atlas Bridge took 18 months to build. Madison understood the legacy systems better than anyone, even with a full team. We're looking at 6 months minimum, and that's assuming we can reverse engineer her logic without documentation." "But we have documentation," Kara protested. "We have her documentation," Carl corrected, "which explicitly states that her logical architecture is proprietary and protected under Section 7.1c. We can't use it without her authorization." The General Counsel, Thomas Wright, had been silent until now. He stood slowly, his face grave. "I need to inform the board that proceeding with deployment would expose the company to significant legal liability. If we deploy and something goes wrong, data breach, system failure, financial losses, we'd be negligent. Our insurance wouldn't cover it. The directors could be held personally liable." That was the killing blow. Personal liability. The two words that make executives' blood run cold. At 11:45, with 5 hours until the investor dinner, Jennifer Walsh made the call. "Operation Horizon is suspended immediately. No deployment, no demonstration, no promises to investors until we resolve the compliance issue." Elliot's face had gone from red to white to gray. His $91 million baby was dead in the water, killed by a single missing signature on page 76 of a binder he'd never bothered to read. But the best part? This was all documented, every decision, every warning ignored, every moment where Elliot chose speed over compliance. The paper trail led straight back to him, the executive who'd promised impossible timelines and fired the one person who could have delivered them. The emergency board meeting convened at 2 p.m. The mahogany table that usually hosted quarterly celebrations now felt like a tribunal. Jennifer Walsh had assembled every piece of evidence: Carl's documentation, Diana's legal analysis, and a timeline showing every ignored warning over the past month. Elliot entered with his usual confidence, but it was theater now. His hands shook slightly as he arranged his papers. Beside him, Kara looked like she'd aged 5 years in 5 hours. The board chairman, Richard Steinberg, didn't bother with pleasantries. Explain to me how a $91 million initiative, one you've been promoting to investors for months, just collapsed 6 hours before launch. Elliot launched into his prepared defense, sliding through polished graphics about scalability, innovation, and market disruption. But Richard cut him off at slide 6. I didn't ask for marketing speak. Elliot, I asked how we got here. That's when Carl stood up. He'd been invited as a technical witness, but what he delivered was a murder weapon. He placed the compliance binder on the table with deliberate ceremony. Page 76, subsection C, clause 7.1c, he said simply. Every IP-sensitive module requires original author authorization. Madison Reed is the original author. Madison Reed was terminated January 3rd. We cannot legally deploy without her signature. This is bureaucratic nonsense, Elliot interjected. We own the code. She wrote it as our employee. Diana Brooks interrupted. Actually, the employment contract specifies that while we own the code, we must respect the intellectual property protocols we ourselves established. Clause 7.1c was implemented to protect the company from patent disputes. Ironically, it's now protecting Madison's architectural decisions from unauthorized deployment. The General Counsel, Thomas Wright, added the final nail. I've reviewed the investor communications. We've made material representations about Operation Horizon's timeline and capabilities. If we can't deliver and legally, we cannot. We're looking at potential SEC violations for misleading investors. Richard's face darkened. Show me the termination paperwork for Madison Reed. Jennifer pulled up the file on the conference room screen. There it was. Performance issues, lazy hands, no spark, $1,500 bonus, 2 weeks severance. You terminated your lead architect, Richard said slowly. The only person who could authorize deployment for performance issues, right before launching a project that depended entirely on her work. She was overpaid and underperforming, Elliot insisted, but his voice had lost its conviction. Carl couldn't stay silent. Madison worked 18-hour days debugging critical failures. She prevented 3 system crashes that would have cost millions. She built Atlas Bridge from nothing. If that's underperforming, I'd like to see what you consider success. Jennifer Walsh pulled up another document. I've been reviewing the Git commits. Madison contributed 87% of the critical codebase. 87%. Elliot, the next highest contributor is at 6%. The room absorbed this in silence. Then Richard asked the question everyone was thinking. Can we bring her back? Diana shook her head. I've made informal inquiries through her former colleagues. She's under no legal obligation to help us, given the circumstances of her departure and the modest severance package. It's unlikely she'd be receptive. Offer her more money, someone suggested. It's not about money anymore, Thomas Wright said quietly. We humiliated her. We dismissed her expertise, took credit for her work, and threw her away with a $1,000 insult. Now we need her signature to save a $91 million deal. What would you do in her position? The phone in the center of the table buzzed. Richard's assistant's voice filled the room. Sir, the investors have arrived. They're asking about the deployment celebration. Richard looked at Elliot. You promised them a revolution by dinner. What exactly do you plan to tell them? Elliot's phone vibrated. A text from legal. Recommend full disclosure immediately. Delaying notification could be construed as deliberate deception. At 4:15 p.m., Elliot stood before the gathered investors in the executive conference room. The champagne they'd ordered sat unopened. The celebration banners hung like surrender flags. We've encountered a compliance issue, he began, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. Operation Horizon requires additional authorization procedures before deployment. An investor from New York interrupted. You told us 3 weeks ago everything was on track. You said your new team lead had everything under control. The situation has evolved. The situation has evolved. Another investor stood up. We allocated $91 million based on your assurances. Are you telling us the Q4 deployment is dead? Jennifer Walsh stepped in, trying to salvage something. We're exploring options to expedite compliance. How long? Carl, standing in the back, answered honestly. Without Madison Reed's cooperation, 6 months minimum to rebuild. With her cooperation, we still need her signature, and she's under no obligation to provide it. The room erupted. Investors were pulling out phones, calling their legal teams. The New York group was already heading for the door. At 4:45, Elliot's phone lit up with a message from the board. Emergency executive session tonight. Your attendance is required. The unspoken message was clear. Start updating your resume. Meanwhile, I sat in a wine bar downtown, watching the news on my phone as Vaymont's stock price began its subtle decline. The financial press had picked up the story. Vaymont Systems delays flagship initiative. Investors express concerns. Tina had texted me the play-by-play. Elliot looks like he's going to vomit. Investors walked out. Board meeting at 6. This is beautiful. The investor dinner that night was supposed to be Elliot's coronation. Instead, it became his execution. The private dining room at the Fairmont had been reserved for 50 guests. Only 12 showed up, and half of those came just to witness the carnage. By 6:30 p.m., the New York investors had formally withdrawn their commitment. $40 million, gone. The Singapore group followed an hour later, another $30 million. The remaining $21 million hung by a thread, contingent on immediate resolution of compliance issues. I wasn't there, of course, but Tina painted the picture through real-time updates. Elliot's trying to give his presentation to an empty room. 2 more investors just left during his ROI projections. Richard Steinberg just asked Elliot to stop talking. The death blow came at 8:45 p.m. The board had discovered something Carl had missed in his initial investigation. Elliot had already spent $12 million on Operation Horizon, server upgrades, consultant fees, that ridiculous team-building retreat in Aspen, the motivational speakers, the rushed infrastructure that didn't work, $12 million spent on a project that couldn't legally launch. Richard Steinberg stood at the head of the table, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. You spent $12 million of company money on a project you couldn't deploy because you fired the only person who could authorize it. The termination was a separate issue. The termination, Richard interrupted, was 3 weeks before launch. You knew Operation Horizon depended on the Atlas Bridge. You knew Madison built it, and you fired her anyway for lazy hands. Jennifer Walsh had done more digging. I've reviewed the performance metrics. Madison's team had the highest productivity scores in the company, the lowest bug rates, the fastest resolution times. By every objective measure, she was our top performer. The soft skills, Elliot began. The soft skills. Richard's composure finally cracked. You just cost us $91 million because you couldn't read a compliance document. Don't lecture us about soft skills. At 9 p.m., the board made their decision. They couldn't fire Elliot immediately, that would signal panic to the market, but they could reassign him to special projects, corporate speak for purgatory. Kara Voss would return to her previous role. Her brief stint as team lead scrubbed from the company directory like it never happened. But the real poetry came in the details. The board appointed Carl Donovan as interim technical lead, with Diana Brooks overseeing compliance. Their first task: document every decision, every shortcut, every ignored warning that led to this failure. The report would be thorough, it would be damning, and it would have Elliot's name on every page. Tuesday morning brought the final insult. Vaymont's stock had dropped 12% overnight. The tech press was calling it the $91 million ego trip. Someone had leaked the story about my $1,500 bonus, and Twitter was having a field day with the math. Elliot had valued my work at approximately 0.0016% of what it was actually worth. The memes were brutal. Someone photoshopped Elliot's face onto the Titanic captain. Another showed a car labeled Operation Horizon, driving off a cliff labeled Page 76. But my favorite came from an anonymous Vaymont employee, a picture of the empty investor dinner with the caption, "When you fire your engineer but keep their code." I received 17 job offers that week. Companies that understood what it meant to build something like Atlas Bridge, who could read between the lines of the news coverage. My starting salary offers were triple what Vaymont had paid me. But I wasn't ready to jump back in yet. Instead, I sat in my apartment, coffee in hand, watching the aftermath unfold through Tina's updates and news coverage. The SEC opened an investigation into the investor communications. The insurance company launched an audit into the $12 million of spent funds. 3 board members resigned, citing differences in governance philosophy. And Elliot. He lasted 6 more weeks in his special projects role before quietly resigning to pursue other opportunities. His LinkedIn update about embracing new challenges got exactly 3 likes, all from recruiters who hadn't read the news. The beautiful irony was that I never had to do anything illegal, unethical, or even unprofessional. I'd followed every rule, documented every requirement, filed every piece of paperwork exactly where it belonged. The trap wasn't what I'd done, it was what they'd refused to do. They'd been so confident in their ability to push through, to ignore the details, to dismiss the expertise they'd thrown away, that they'd walked straight into a wall they could have easily avoided by simply reading the documentation. $91 million, $12 million spent, multiple careers destroyed, a company's reputation in tatters. All because Elliot Crane thought I had lazy hands and no spark. All because he never read Page 76. The victory tasted like expensive coffee, dark, complex, with notes of satisfaction that lingered long after the cup was empty. Wednesday morning, 8 a.m., the Vaymont Systems building stood against the Seattle skyline like a monument to corporate ambition. Inside, the executive floor was eerily quiet. The usual buzz of Operation Horizon had died, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of security guards doing their rounds. Elliot's office, that corner suite with the panoramic view, sat empty. His nameplate had been removed overnight, leaving only 4 small holes in the door where it had been mounted. Someone from facilities had already started boxing up his things: the Italian espresso machine, the signed baseball from the company softball tournament, the framed magazine cover where he'd been featured as Seattle's innovation leader. The morning light cast long shadows through his windows, the same windows where he'd dismissed me 8 weeks earlier with 4 words that he thought were clever. Now those windows reflected nothing but an empty chair and a desk cleared of its authority. In the bullpen below, the remnants of the innovation squad sat in silence. The motivational posters had been taken down, leaving clean rectangles on the walls where the paint was slightly brighter. The fail fast, fail forward t-shirts had disappeared into desk drawers, never to be worn again. Kara's desk had been moved back to its original spot on the 3rd floor. Her brief taste of power evaporated like morning mist. Carl Donovan was in early, as always, but now he occupied the lead architect's office, my old office. He'd already started the 6-month process of rebuilding what they'd tried to deploy without understanding. On his desk sat the compliance binder, open to Page 76, a daily reminder of what happens when you ignore the details. The board met one final time about Operation Horizon at 9 a.m. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. The project was officially terminated, written off as a $12 million lesson in hubris. The meeting notes, which would later be subpoenaed by the SEC, contained one particularly damning line. The board acknowledges that dismissing key technical personnel without proper succession planning constituted a critical failure in risk management. By noon, the tech press had picked up another angle of the story. Someone had calculated that if Vaymont had simply given me a proper bonus, say, $50,000, none of this would have happened. For want of $48,500, they'd lost $91 million. The math was so absurd, it became its own meme, the $48,000 butterfly effect. I watched all of this from my apartment. My old coffee mug, the one from my desk at Vaymont, filled with a particularly expensive Colombian blend I'd bought to celebrate. Not celebrate the destruction, exactly, but the vindication. Every principle I'd fought for, every standard I'd maintained, every warning I'd documented had been proven right. At 2 p.m., my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It was Richard Steinberg, the board chairman himself, his voice carefully modulated to hide what sounded like desperation. "Madison, this is Richard Steinberg from Vaymont. I'd like to discuss a consulting arrangement. We're prepared to offer significant compensation for your assistance in resolving our current technical challenges. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." I deleted the message without returning the call. Some bridges, once burned, illuminated everything you needed to see. By Thursday, Vaymont had quietly posted 17 new engineering positions, all requiring extensive documentation skills and strong compliance awareness. The starting salaries were 40% higher than what they'd been paying before. The market had learned what Vaymont's engineers were worth, even if Vaymont learned it too late. Friday afternoon, 4:30 p.m. I stood outside a different office building, holding a new employee badge for a company that had offered me everything Vaymont wouldn't respect: recognition, and a compensation package that actually reflected my value. My new CEO had personally called to recruit me, having read between the lines of the Vaymont coverage. "Anyone who can architect something that complex and document it that thoroughly is exactly who we need," she'd said. As I walked to my car that evening, my phone showed one final update from Tina. "They're still finding Elliot's promises in the system. Marketing materials for features that never existed. Investor projections based on capabilities we never had. It's like archaeological excavation of corporate delusion." I thought about responding, but instead, I just smiled and put my phone away. The story was over. The trap had served its purpose, not through malice or sabotage, but through the simple act of following rules that everyone else had ignored. That evening, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, looking out at the Seattle skyline. Somewhere in that maze of glass and steel, the Vaymont building stood with one less light on the executive floor, a $91 million deal buried in paperwork, a CFO's career reduced to a cautionary tale, all because he'd looked at 18 months of my work and saw only lazy hands and no spark. The wine was good, the view was perfect, and on page 76 of a binder in Carl Donovan's office, Clause 7.1c remained unchanged, waiting for the next executive who thought documentation was beneath them. Some might call it revenge. I preferred to think of it as engineering identifying a system's critical vulnerability and documenting it thoroughly. After all, I'd always been good at documentation. Thank you for listening to this story of corporate karma and the power of reading the fine print. Where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below and let's connect. I'd love to know what corner of the world you're listening from. If you enjoyed this tale of revenge served with a side of compliance documentation, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed corporate justice like this in your own workplace? Let me know in the comments.